So, Sharon, before we get too deep into today's discussion, we've been talking about people with disabilities, including LGBT people with disabilities, but we haven't yet defined what that is. Could you do so for those watching?
I'd be glad to, Jen. There is a lot of confusion about the definition of disability. Most people think of disability as a person with disability is someone in a wheelchair, or someone who is blind and is using a white cane, something very, very obvious. However, there is a legal definition of disability which is broader, and this is part of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Americans with Disabilities Act states that a person with a disability is a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And when we define major life activities, we're talking about things such as walking, talking, seeing, hearing. Those would be considered major life activities. Secondly, it would be a person who has a history or a record of such an impairment. So that would be a record of accommodations by an employer or a medical record. And thirdly, a person who is perceived by others as having a disability. And in the legal world, this part of the definition means that an employer has given that individual accommodations. They're looked upon by an employer as having a disability. People with disabilities, I want you to remember, come in all shapes, sizes, levels of education, just like everybody else. And so this is kind of important to remember. We're not all in one box, and I'm an individual with disability, so I can say we when we're talking about that. And so nobody with any disability is like anyone else with a disability.
I think one thing to note here is that a disability can really be acquired at any point in someone's life. And in my experience in talking with the small employers as part of this project, I noticed repeatedly that had never crossed their mind before, that they could be fine today and have some kind of accident tomorrow that could lead to some kind of disability.
I agree with you. Often employers, or actually people in general, think of individuals with disabilities as people who were born with a disability. But I've also run into people who realize that you can acquire or have experienced the fact that you can acquire a disability at any time during one's life. And so that gives the employer a vision of a person with a disability which is very, very different than that person might actually be.
So as we're talking about people with disabilities and we're talking about the qualities that make a great employee, what could make someone with a disability a great employee, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, I want to make the point that our experience, and I'm talking about my experience with ALDOT and that of the members of the Connecticut Business Leadership Network, they have found that when they have hired an employee with a disability, it has disproved the myth that employees with disabilities might be less reliable than those without disabilities. And this is something very important to remember. Employees with disabilities, again, like I said, come in all shapes, sizes, and educational levels. And so they be working at all different kinds of jobs.
The one caveat I do want to kind of point out here is that not all people with disabilities are created equal, so to speak. So we're speaking from personal experience. So we're not saying broadly that everyone with a disability is inevitably going to be a greater employee. However, in our experience, we have seen that to be the case.
That is very true. Individuals with disabilities do not come equipped with halos and wings, and they have all the same qualities, good and bad, as everyone else. So you're going to find great employees with disabilities and maybe not so great employees with disabilities. But the likelihood is, because of that appreciation of the opportunity, that you're going to find a really great employee with a disability. And you may ask, why suddenly are there all these employees out there with disabilities? I want to go back a little bit because this is important. Over the last 25 or 30 years, we have seen a change in the education system where individuals with disabilities have been mainstreamed into the classroom. The expectations are different. They have transition training where they get the opportunity and learn to transition to employment from high school or from high school into college and then employment. And that's why individuals with disabilities are the new great wave of employees.
Well, I hope by this point in time, those watching are thinking, well, where can I find a qualified individual with a disability as an employer?
I would recommend them to the workplace because that is a great place to start. However, you will find references to additional resources in the toolkit. And you as a small employer can find answers to the questions you have about hiring people with disabilities and diversifying your workforce, to include them and LGBT people with disabilities, and also provide you with the services that you need.
In our experience, I know for me personally as well as for you, we've found that it's no harder to hire someone with a disability. And as we've outlined today, the benefits are great in doing so. And it's not nearly as difficult as an employer may think. In fact, they may find their best employee yet.
I couldn't agree with you more, Jen. We hope that you found the information useful. To find out more, you can reference the toolkit, which is located on the workplace website, or you can contact the workplace. Thank you for your time.